What do these two games have in common? Other than being programmed by Geoff Crammond, and having cars in them, and having fake names for the drivers, and me being significantly less good at them than I would like. Look, it's me. You know the story already. It's going to be something boring and deeply technical. So let's stave off that technical explanation at least a few minutes by talking about Revs. Or rather, Revs' descendant, Geoff Crammond's Formula One Grand Prix, or, for those of you in the US, World Circuit. What you're seeing on screen here is a tremendous amount of wasted childhood on my part, speeding around the 1991 Formula One season on my 286. Although, to give the whole story, I didn't own this until it became a budget release, and most of my early childhood wasting was done on my cousin's Atari ST, or at our neighbour's house across the road, where they had this game for the Amiga. Now, 2 out of 3 of those were affordable computers, and even having a 286 wasn't exactly living a baller lifestyle by the early 1990s. Revs was for the BBC Micro. The only kids who had a BBC Micro in the day were the ones who wore a top hat and monocle to school. I did not go to that kind of school. If someone had turned up like that at our school, their hat would have been dented and their monocle stolen to use for setting fire to ants and other people's rucksacks within minutes. Revs did later turn up on the C64, but compared to, say, Elite, which got ported to everything including the NES, that is just one other platform. And anyway, in addition to being a hat-bashing moral wasteland where I grew up, the Spectrum, CPC and Electron ruled supreme in the realm of the home 8-bit micros, with not a speck of Commodore hardware to be found until the Amiga entered our lives, usually with the near-ubiquitous Batman pack. So Revs, especially for someone of my age who was technically around at the time, but at that point more concerned with the antics of the Mr. Men and whether we could have jelly out of the big rabbit mould that night, was always defined in terms of its successors. This is the racing game Geoff Crammond wrote first. He didn't step out of a Stargate with a stunt car racer disc in his hand, or, let's try to do period-correct references here, quantum leap from another point in space-time to give Formula One GP to the masses. First, there was Revs. It's the original sim racing game. It's got code hidden in the sky, and you bet I'm talking about that later. These things got brought up in the context of other games which they influenced, but rarely in a dedicated look at Revs in its own right. All of this is a bit of a shame, because Revs is really rather good. The BBC Micro had a sort of staid respectability to it, because it was the one you had in your school for being educated on. And even as a child, I had a dim awareness it was related to the Acorn Electron we had at home for playing games on, but the BBC was for worthy things like doing maths quizzes or programming logo, or maybe as a rare treat, getting to play Granny's Garden. The fact that playing Granny's Garden was considered a treat tells you a lot about growing up in 1980s Britain. At least it was better than being made to drink the milk which had sat out in the sun for 3 hours. Revs, as I may have indicated by calling it really rather good, is not an experience to file alongside spoiled milk and disturbing edutainment. It is so playable, even today, far more so than many of its sluggish 8-bit contemporaries. It helps that the BBC supported analog joysticks because it was a grown-up, sensible computer, but even on the keyboard this is a lot of fun. One flaw with early racing games is they can feel like the only thing which makes a difference to cornering is whether you're above or below the magic speed at which you start drifting to the outside of a corner, no matter when you press the key to steer. Revs feels like there are racing lines. Some of them are faster than others. There is value in learning some technique, rather than just memorising which gear each corner should be taken in. Something I find interesting is just how nervous the game is about even this relatively low basic level of fidelity. Upon starting it, there are reams of text explaining the context, the specifications of the Formula 3 car you'll be driving, even giving you the correct keys to press to get the car moving, and some initial settings to make it handle in an approachable manner. What I'm playing here is the initial 1984 release, which contains just one track. While that might seem limited, there's a depth to this which is unusual for an early 8-bit game. Not just that you can do a full race with qualifying invisible computer opponents on track, but that the game's rendition of Silverstone is itself satisfying to master as well as accurate. Or, if you're me, at least get to the point where your approach to the old Woodcote chicane is driving round it properly and not taking a Dukes of Hazzard leap across it. The following year, Acornsoft released an expansion pack, Revs 4 Tracks. This added 4 more British racing circuits: Donington Park, Snetterton, Alton Park, and, what came closest to being my local circuit, Brands Hatch. In 1986 came Revs Plus, which bundled the original game with its expansion disc into a 5-track version, and became one of the first driving games to tackle the problem of touchy keyboard controls, by adding something very familiar to anyone who played F1 GP on a keyboard or digital joystick: computer-aided steering. Compare this final computer-assisted version of the keyboard controls to the utter nightmare that is, say, hard driving on the Specky, and it's a surprise Acornsoft didn't shout about this more, because this is a genuinely nice keyboard control mechanic. I even prefer it to the later version featured in F1 GP. It's a little less forgiving of late inputs. It doesn't give you such an excessively on-rails feeling and, in my opinion, lets you place the car on track more accurately. Let me remind you, this is 1986. There were games out there with control schemes like press any key on the home row to go left and any key on the bottom row to go right, except M, which is for turbo boost. This was considered entirely normal and unremarkable. This game is like when 1900s Prussia attempted to standardise having a throttle pedal on the right, a clutch on the left, and a brake in the middle, only for the rest of the world to go, "Nah fam, we'd like another 15 years of having the throttle be a lever on the steering wheel, or a pedal in the middle that gives you less acceleration the more it's pressed, or even, if we're feeling particularly sassy, then maybe both of those on the same vehicle." Which, for reference, would be the 1900 Wilson Pilcher. I checked. This did happen. As mentioned earlier, Revs also graced the Commodore 64 in 1985. This gains a fancy title screen and loses all the introductory text, C64 users apparently being less in need of a lengthy explanation about what a simulation is. But it's more or less the same game once you're behind the wheel. Impressive, given the C64's 6510 CPU runs at half the speed of the Beeb's otherwise very similar 6502 processor. C64 Revs gained Brands Hatch from Revs 4 Tracks to go with Silverstone in the base game, and when Revs Plus came to the Commodore machine in 1987, it added a unique extra track to the platform, Germany's Nürburgring, the shorter modern GP variant, not the Nordschleife. That might have been a bit too much ambition, even for a technically ambitious game. The C64 version of Revs Plus also has this strange step in the loader, where you choose which 2 of the 6 tracks will actually be available for the game session. I guess they were at the limit of what could be crushed into the computer. Wait, I don't guess, because this is me. I went and looked it up. Yes, this is very much at the limit, especially on the Beeb. Revs on the BBC runs on the base 32KB configuration of a BBC Model B. 32 kilobytes. Barely enough to hold 2 copies of the script I'm reading, even in plain text. I took a screenshot in the emulator while making this video that took 10 times the amount of memory this game needs. Well, of course, you know the secret. Code that's hidden in the sky, right? It's what Revs is famous for. The one soundbite every retro gaming YouTuber, or at least the scriptwriter they keep hidden in a cupboard, can come up with when asked about it. I'm pretty sure I've done the same. Code in the sky is only the start of the clever tricks that Revs pulls. The limited memory of the BBC Micro seems even more limited when you look at how its graphics work. With the exception of Mode 7, a character-based display designed to be broadly compatible with the teletext and view data systems, the BBC offers a selection of bitmap graphics modes of varying resolutions and colour depths. Unlike the Spectrum, with its memory-saving attribute map approach, Any pixel can be any available colour, regardless of the adjacent pixels. This means no attribute clash, but also not so much spare memory. A big problem, since the BBC, like most 8-bit home computers, does not have any dedicated graphics memory. Graphics use the main system memory, and whatever you use for the screen isn't available for other code or data. Well, usually it isn't available. I'll get to that in a bit. If you looked at a screenshot of Revs and came over all technical, you might assume that with 7 colours on screen, the only mode capable of displaying this would be Mode 2, which offers 8 colours at a resolution of 160 by 256 on a UK beep, and also takes up over half the available memory at a whopping 20 kilobytes, because it's technically a 16 colour mode. All 8 colours available on the BBC, plus the same colours again, except this time, flashing. But then you might also spot that the text at the top of the screen is too sharp to be rendered at that horizontal resolution of just 160 pixels. And since the maximum number of concurrent colours available in any of the BBC's free 20 pixel modes is 4, there must be something going on. Which indeed there is. Revs switches both mode and palette as it draws the screen. It gets away with this because the BBC Micro would have displayed its output on a CRT monitor. And since the beam in a CRT scans line by line, you can change horizontal resolution or palette in the middle of the process, providing you time it carefully for when the beam is returning from the end of drawing one line before it's ready to start the next. So in Revs, the top of the screen is drawn in Mode 4, a free 20 pixel wide mode which offers just 2 colours. In this case, a blue and yellow palette is used. For the next section, Crammond switches to Mode 5, a 160 pixel wide mode which allows displaying a palette of 4 colours from the BBC's choice of 8, all of which are set to blue. I've already kind of given the game away on why this happens, but stick with me because we can have a lot more fun jabbering on about palettes first. Because we get near the bottom of the sky and the palette changes to blue, green, white and black for a tiny section, which is there because the rear wings of the AI cars can protrude above the horizon, and when you look at them, you'll realise that cleverly none of the parts which do can be red, leaving a slot free to keep the blue colour in the palette for this transition. A few lines below, Crammond swaps blue for red, and the game now has the correct colours available for drawing the trackside curbs and the top of the dashboard. Finally, with the track out of the way, the green is swapped out for cyan to give a little extra texture on the bottom of the dashboard and use every colour available on the BBC except for magenta, which apparently must have been Geoff Crammond's least favourite. There's some additional cleverness going on in that while the palettes get swapped, the colours being changed will never be used near the point at which the switch happens, meaning there's no flicker even if it happens slightly earlier or later than expected, which could happen on a BBC Micro, and lent some of the games which used this mode and palette swapping approach a noticeable flicker at each boundary. But all of this mode swapping colour exchanging trickery means Revs only uses 8 kilobytes for its on-screen graphics, leaving 24 kilobytes for code and data, which isn't enough. Here comes that magic trick. We have a section of memory representing a screen with a 2-bit colour depth. If you think of this in terms of bytes, the value 0 is 4 pixels, all set to colour 0. 255 is 4 pixels, all set to colour 3. 23 is a pixel set to colour 0, 2 pixels set to colour 1, and 1 pixel set to colour 3. In Revs, there's a section of the screen where colour 0 is blue, colour 1 is blue, colour 2 is blue, and colour 3 is blue. It doesn't matter what number you think of, the end result is 4 pixels of blue, which means that part of the sky is slightly over 2 kilobytes of space into which Revs packs 1.2k of variables, plus the main gain loop and some functions dealing with text input, driver statistics, and drawing the enemy cars. All of which is, as far as the player is concerned and indeed can see, blue. Yet this is not the only thing Revs hides in plain sight. Everybody points at the invisible code in the sky, but I think they should also be pointing at the track. This is not a standard bend toward the horizon track as you'd see even in arcade games of the day. It's a full 3D object represented in 1024 approximately 4 meter long segments to 16-bit accuracy, which, at the scale of Revs, is to the nearest 4 centimeters. You can do proper 3D object things like turn the car around 180 degrees and drive in the opposite direction. This should use a lot more memory than it does. Also, if you think of this as effectively a 1024 polygon object plus whatever's needed for the curbs on the corners, it should also be using a lot more CPU than it does, which it clearly doesn't because it runs smoothly on a BBC Model B. The trick is that a racing track is not necessarily a general 3D object, at least in the world of Revs. It is composed of sections with particular track-like properties such as straights and curves. What Geoff Crammond realised is you don't have to encode every point on the track. You can just pick a starting point, set a vector for the direction, and how many times that vector repeats until you need to stop and pick a new direction. So this is how Silverstone or Brands Hatch work in game. Pick a starting point, then say, go north 3.2 meters, go east 1.1 meters, and go down 5 centimeters. Repeat 100 times, and now you have a 340-odd meter straight with a gentle downhill gradient. In a game where every byte counts, these small vectors only need to be 8-bit values, and in Revs 4 tracks, Geoff Crammond added yet another optimization which encoded corners, not as a sequence of vectors, but as one vector for the initial direction of the curve, and another vector for the amount by which that vector should change each step, which both saves a lot of space and also gets a little too close to unpleasant memories of trying to understand integration in A-level maths for my liking. What this means is Revs tracks take up even less memory than the sum total of my retained knowledge about calculus, under 2 kilobytes per track, although the data was typically padded to exactly 2000 bytes, presumably to keep the layout and offset simple. The other great thing about this segment-based approach is, so long as you know where you are on the track and which direction the car is facing, you don't need to process the entire track to draw it. All you need is to generate enough track segments to draw as far as the horizon. And this basic idea continued for a huge number of racing games until 3D hardware became fast enough and memory available in such obscene quantities that it was simpler and quicker to just throw fully modelled sections of track around than try to generate them on the fly. One day I may even cover some of them and be able to go, hey, see this? It's basically the trick from Revs on the BBC Micro. Including, naturally, Formula 1 Grand Prix. In case you were wondering if I'd ever addressed the point I raised at the start of this video. Yes, that uses what is recognisably an evolution of the segment and vector system, first pioneered in Revs. And yet, that's not the last secret lurking on this screen. There's one other thing you don't see in front of you on Revs that was a familiar occurrence on 8-bit games, especially the ones which tilted at 3D. Flicker. Because despite all the memory constraints on the BBC Model B, Revs uses up some of that limited memory to perform double buffering. Now it's not quite double buffering in the sense of draw something that takes a while to draw off screen, then copy it quickly while the electron beam is somewhere else though. Because in yet another bit of optimization, Crammond combined double buffering with a line fill routine to make filling those track segments easier. Revs has an off-screen buffer, shaped much like the car dashboard. As you may expect from that code in the sky trick, the gaps are used for other data and code. But the routine which copies from this buffer to the screen has a neat trick. Color 0 doesn't get interpreted as copy black, it gets interpreted as keep writing the previous color. So Revs only needs to plot the start of each new area of color on a given line, making dealing with that off-screen buffer much faster than if it painted the whole track image and copied it. Meanwhile, the routine which copies this to the screen memory is barely any slower than a naive copy, while giving horizontal line fills, effectively for free. which combined with all these other tricks is how you get fast fluid graphics and a full 3D track on a BBC Micro, along with a convincing simulation and other cars to race against. As long as you don't mind racing them under clear blue skies, because that's where the code's hidden. Even this, worryingly nerdy as it may be, barely dents the hat Revs keeps all its tricks under. And if you're interested in seeing more of the things it does to fit within the constraints of the Model B, then I recommend Mark Moxon's annotated source code and commentary over on bbcelite.com, which was an invaluable resource while I was putting together this video. Link, inevitably, in the description, and also mini Legend of Zelda games. And with all of that, I think it's time I did some optimization of my own, which is to spend a bit more time playing Revs, rather than just talking about it. It's that good. Now, if only I could find a posh kid to freshen with aggravated monocle theft and solar-powered formicarium arson, unless they let me have a go on their BBC Micro. When I think they should also be pointing at the track. That's not a good pointing. That's not something that you should probably put on YouTube. That's like getting into, gosh, streamers who make millions in hot tubs and whatever. I don't think you're going to do.